Hello friends! Today we are going to draw a bus. This is not an easy drawing, so I recommend starting with a sketch. I posted this bus sketch on my community, so feel free to check it out. If you're hesitant to tackle the full drawing, you can start by sketching just the bus. After watching this tutorial, I'm sure you'll be able to draw the entire piece. Take into account the tips I gave in my community post. The drawing is a bit challenging because there are some background details, and the bus itself has to be structured in a way that it really looks like a bus. Start by identifying the basic shapes. First, we have a horizontal line. There's a slight perspective here as the road angles toward us. However, the sidewalk line in the reference is horizontal. Behind the sidewalk there's a building, a little fence, and some structures in the background. And now we can mark where the bus is, ensuring it stays in place without shifting left or right. You can leave a bit more space in front of the bus. I've marked it out as a rough rectangle, and Big Ben's tower is slightly to the right, not directly in the centre, but a bit off to the side. Once you've placed all the main elements, you can start refining the details. Make sure the top of Big Ben's tower fits within the frame. In the reference, the tip of the roof is just barely cut off, and I've done the same. Some other random structures can be sketched out quickly as well. I'll mention that the reference was originally an oil painting, which made it a bit tricky to translate into watercolor. So feel free to adjust techniques as you wish. The key is that you enjoy the process. For example, I've made the bus wheels look foggy to give a sense of distance. The Big Ben Tower is more clearly defined in my version. It was even more distorted in the original, so I found a similar photo online and used that for reference. Notice how, if the sidewalk is horizontal, the bottom of the bus should also be nearly horizontal, maybe just slightly narrowing. The top of the bus, however, narrows quite a bit. Since the perspective is coming from an angle, the corner of the bus that's closer to us has lines that recede into the distance, causing the top right corner to slope downward. So, as you can see, all the upper edges of this box lean toward the horizon line. Now I estimate where the second floor of the bus will be, keeping the proportions of the rectangles in mind. I simplify the details a bit to avoid getting too caught up in them and leave a bit of looseness in the overall drawing. I don't want to detail every little thing, but it's important to establish the overall shape, to make sure the bus stands evenly and that one wheel isn't higher than the other. I draw a guideline for where the wheels will sit. This helps keep everything level. Personally, drawing vehicles like this is more challenging for me than drawing people, but sometimes I like to take on these kinds of projects to push myself out of my comfort zone. I hope you do the same. Some of you might enjoy working with precise, clean lines like these. When drawing the bumper, whether mentally or on paper, try to draw a central axis. Note that the axis is slightly off from the actual centre due to perspective. Since the part of the bus that is closer to us appears larger, the left front corner of the bus looks bigger than the right, more distant corner. Based on this, you can position the bumper and headlights. Just like when drawing faces of animals or people where one eye is hidden behind the nose, here too, one headlight is partially hidden behind the bumper. When you start drawing the windows, keep in mind the rules of perspective. The windows further from us will appear narrower. You can draw guidelines to indicate where the tops and bottoms of the windows will be. Make sure they all fit evenly across the bus. I slightly adjusted the proportions. There are probably more windows on the real bus, especially on the lower level, but I didn't want to spend too much time on that. Based on what I saw, I felt that the number of windows I drew was sufficient. On the first level, the windows vary in height, with some taller and some shorter. On the second level, they're simpler, all the same height, just spaced evenly and slightly decreasing in size as they get farther from us. You can start by drawing a grid. First, draw horizontal lines that narrow as they move into the distance, then add vertical lines to form a grid. Once you have that, you can erase and refine the windows. Let's continue with the background now. I'll clarify the horizon line. There's a streetlight behind the bus, which helps organise the background. A common mistake for beginners is drawing objects in the foreground too short because they're afraid of giving them enough height. Our brains tend to slow down here. For example, when we imagine a mountain in the background and a tree in the foreground, we think the mountain should be taller. But because the tree is closer, it can block part of the mountain. In this case, the streetlight is about the same height as the buildings in the background. To draw a person in this scene, you don't need to focus too much on proportions. A simple rectangle for the jacket and basic legs will suffice. The people in this scene are holding umbrellas, so one of their arms will be bent to hold the umbrella at chest height. You can represent the hand with just a colour block. The people here are quite stylised, and the umbrellas aren't always perfectly horizontal. Some are at angles, while others are straight. In terms of height, the people in the foreground, in front of the bus, are taller because they're closer to us, while those behind the bus are smaller. The second line, where the buildings and fence start, is farther back. The street markings here are slightly angled, though to be honest, they look a little odd compared to the bus. If the markings turn that way, then the bus would likely be parallel to them, but in this case, it's not. Let's leave it as it is and not get too caught up in the details. Here, we have a couple standing together. Drawing them is a bit trickier. The effect of them standing next to each other is achieved by slightly sloping the man's left shoulder, making it seem like he's leaning towards the woman. It gives the impression that he's gently leaning in, perhaps to offer her more cover under the umbrella, like a gentleman. The woman is also drawn in profile, similar to the man, but with a slight bust shape in front. Instead of pants, she has a skirt that's more straightened. The umbrellas are drawn above the couple and the gentleman next to them. When drawing, you may want to check the proportions of Big Ben, especially its width. Here, we also need to show perspective through the tilted lines of the floors. The side of Big Ben facing us has less tilt, while the right side has a stronger tilt because it's turned more away from us. The higher the floors, the more pronounced the angles of these dividing lines should be. In theory, the higher the floors, the more angled these horizontal lines should be. I deliberately didn't focus too much on perspective here, though. Looking back, it might have been worth tilting the upper floors more. As I record the voiceover now, I realise that adjusting the tower's top floors could have added to the effect. However, even if we don't see the vanishing points, they're outside the sheet's borders. The higher floors should tilt more, especially the clock tower. To draw the clock face, start by sketching a square. I've already erased mine, but it's easier to begin with a square and then fit the circle inside. This way you can more easily grasp the perspective of the clock face, which should be slightly distorted because it follows the laws of perspective. The circle on the right side of the tower will be more skewed than the one facing us. So, it's better to start with a square. I eyeballed it here, but for those less experienced with drawing circles in perspective, starting with a square is a good idea. Now I'm applying masking fluid using a brush that I've pre-lathered with soap to make it easier to remove the fluid later. A quick reminder, when working with masking fluid, you should apply it quickly and wash your brush right after. If you don't have masking fluid, you can leave some areas blank and then touch them up later with white paint or correction fluid. Before starting to apply colour, I recommend making a light sketch of where the light will fall. This painting will involve a lot of wet-on-wet washes with multiple colours, so it's best to plan the colours in advance to avoid rushing when the paper starts to dry. If you take the time to mix the colours beforehand, you'll be better prepared for each stage. Now I'm wetting the areas around the tower. You can wet both sides of the tower, as the tower divides the page into two parts. If you feel confident, you can mix the same shade for the sky on both sides, but if you prefer, you can work on one side of the sky first and then the other. Here, I'm using two granulating colours for the sky, Oxide Black from Van Gogh and Ultramarine from Nevskaya Palitra. Both are granulating colours, and I wanted to achieve this specific effect. In general, you can just use black with ultramarine if you like the granulation effect in the sky that you see in the photos. If you mix ultramarine with a brown colour, you'll get a greyish hue. So if you're aiming for a grey sky and want to use ultramarine, it's better to combine it with black. Speaking of granulating colours, especially ultramarine, you'll notice that when it dries it looks much lighter than when first applied. Initially the strokes seem very dark, but as the pigment gathers and the paper shows through, the colour lightens during drying. Keep this in mind when working with ultramarine. I switched to another brush for the street light and added a glowing spot while the paper was still wet. Don't make it too yellow. You can even leave it almost white or a very pale, transparent yellow. As for the Ferris wheel in the background, I used a dry brush to lift some colour, though I hadn't really painted over it much. Look at how black the strokes appear, but as they start to granulate and interact with the water, the effect changes. The more water you use, the more the colours will spread and gather in granulated patterns. If you want to achieve this beautiful granulation effect, avoid overworking the paint. On the other hand, if you want to break up the large blotches, you can do so with a brush in drier areas. Since everything is still wet, I'm adding the tree in the background. I want the whole background to be soft and blurred, so make sure to add darker accents to the tree since it's evening, and you can mix purples and blues to create the tree's shadowy parts. Add a touch of yellow to the leaves where they're lit by the streetlight. It doesn't need to be too bright, just enough to show that the leaves are glowing slightly from the light. At this point, I don't have any paint on my brush. I'm just softening the granulation to create the effect of diagonal clouds, or maybe even rain streaking across the sky. That's why I'm adding some diagonal strokes while the paint is still wet. Then I start outlining the buildings, leaving a bit of space between the tree and the streetlight to avoid painting over them. I'm continuing the wash across the whole sky, keeping everything wet. As you approach Big Ben, try not to make the transition too sharp, although sometimes when working wet on wet, the paint can pool and create a defined edge if too much water gathers. This happened a little on the right side of my painting. I repeat the same colour on the right side, and it's important to make sure that both sides match in tone. I've already pre-mixed the colours, so now it's just a matter of filling in this area. I decided to play with water a bit here to see what kinds of textures and patterns emerge. This is entirely up to personal preference, so feel free to experiment. Now we need to let the background dry before moving on to the buildings. At this stage, you could start working on reflections, though it might be a bit tricky while everything is still wet. Since it's not yet clear what will be reflected in the water, we'll wait for the background to dry, or you can speed it up using a hairdryer. For the tower, I'm using a sienna colour, not ochre, as ochre is too yellow. There's a lighter sienna shade and a darker one, and I'm using the lighter, more brownish version. For the first wash, I'm simply covering the entire tower evenly with one colour. I'm not mixing anything, just using the colour as is. There's a blotch, but it won't be visible later. I wanted to work in daylight, but now I think it's actually easier to see under artificial light. For the shadows, mix indanthrene blue with a bit of brown, not a yellowish brown, but a darker, more muted brown to tone down the blue and give it a nice greyish tint. Since the tower is still wet, the colour will spread a bit. I've mixed a greyish blue colour for the roof, and I'll use the same shade to add shadows. I'm applying it wet on wet, so it will soften the brightness of the tower, giving it a nice complex wash of colours. Once the tower dries, we'll add the more defined shadows and lines. You can already add a few strokes to the roof if it's dry enough, but be careful not to add too much black into the wet wash, as it will spread too much and darken the tower. Where the paper has dried a bit, you can add a few details. The clock face is still too bright, so I'll add a very diluted bluish-grey wash to tone it down. The left side of the tower is darker, so I'll intensify the shadows on that side slightly. I'm using the same colours for the roof and the building next to Big Ben. I believe it's part of the same architectural ensemble, so the colours are the same. Greyish blue for the roof, and sienna for the walls and windows. There are some details here, but remember that the building extends right down to the sidewalk. There's a little fence, but behind it, there are still buildings. Friends, thank you for watching this video. This video is part of my paid lessons. You can access more paid lessons through Patreon directly from my website. Thank you for your support. I also appreciate any donations, even if you're not ready to join the paid lessons but still enjoy my videos and want to support the channel. You can find all the ways to support me in the channel description. Thank you. Please like and share with your friends. We'll leave the bus for later. Right now, we'll work on the reflections. I want to finish all the wet-on-wet work with the background before moving on to the bus. So, now I'm wetting the paper and tilting the sheet so that the paint flows downward, as all the reflections will be flowing downwards. Since I'm working with block-bound paper, it's easy to tilt. If you're working on a board, you can also tilt it at an angle. There will be a lot of colours in the reflections, and I recommend starting with the lighter colours, as yellows can easily get muddy. so it's logical to begin with them. The lines from the masking fluid might interfere with the painting a bit, but that's okay. You can soften them with a brush. Ideally, I wanted to do the entire reflection wet on wet, but for some reason my paper started drying too quickly, probably because it was tilted. Now look closely at the headlights. While we initially drew a circle, the actual light in rainy conditions would appear more like a glowing halo than a perfect circle. So we'll create that halo effect while the paint is still wet. Later you can use pencils to add reddish tones in areas that will be brighter, like the side closest to us and the hood. In the reference, the hood looks paler, probably because of shadows, but I think it turned out paler than expected. I'm adding some burgundy to the bottom, all while working wet on wet. I've opted for a slightly looser, more casual style. Of course, if you prefer, you can draw more precisely, but I wanted to retain a bit of the roughness seen in the reference oil painting while translating it into watercolor. This adds a certain relaxed, unpolished feeling to the piece, where some brush strokes just hint at warmer or cooler tones. On the second level of the bus, I've done the same, adding warm tones where needed and cooler ones elsewhere. In the headlights, make sure to show that they're resting on a red surface, but be gentle so that the yellow light halo remains. If you carefully add a drop of red to the yellow, it will push the red pigment outward, but you still want the light's outline to be visible. As you can see, the outlines are still a bit messy, and I'll refine them later with some black. I'm currently going over the second level of the bus, and I'm working on the windows wet on wet. In the windows, I wanted to give the impression that there's someone behind the wheel. Not sure how well that came across, but I was aiming to show that it's not just a flat surface, that there's something going on inside. For the bus grille, I'm starting with a light grey, and then I'll add darker areas on top. I wanted to hint at a driver's head inside, Not a fully realised figure, but just enough to suggest something inside the bus. For the windows, I'm using a greyish tone, since they'll likely reflect the street outside, which is full of grey and brownish tones. There might be a figure in the window, like a head, that you can represent with a small blotch. My loose style here reflects the reference, where the head is hinted at but not clearly defined. Remember that oil painting's rough style is different from watercolour's rough style. In oil, you can add rough, thick brush strokes, whereas in watercolour, you might want to experiment with dry brush strokes to create more abstract effects. I left some white gaps in the windows to represent highlights. The side of the bus closest to us will be more lit, while the far side is darker. You can emphasise this. My wheels turned out to be different colours, one darker, one lighter. So I might adjust the front wheel, but in my community drawing I detailed the wheels more thoroughly. Here, I kept them simpler, just hinting at where the light and dark areas are. Now, let's add the figures. As I mentioned before, these people are quite simplified. Just a head, hand and a mostly black outfit. You might leave a white collar visible and the hand positioned at chest height to show that the person is holding an umbrella. There's not much complexity to the figures. The legs and arms are sketched in, though you could make the leg of the person closest to the bus a little thicker. It's not very noticeable though, as these figures are mostly indicated rather than fully detailed. For the woman, I'm adding some shading to her clothes, with a light grey and suggesting brown hair. For skin tones, you can use a diluted reddish-brown or a sienna mixed with a redder hue. The figures farther away are even more simplified because they're more distant. You don't need to fill them in with solid colour. You can leave some gaps, like for a collar. They're drawn loosely, and I'm fine with this level of detail. Now we'll add some more details, many of which I've already sketched in. The strokes are still quite loose. What's important is that they follow the right direction. You can add the clock face and more defined lines to the levels of Big Ben, taking care to note where the shadows are and where the lighter areas are. The strokes are rough, almost dry brushed, breaking off in various places. I'm also adding a few lines to the buildings, using a nearly dry brush. I tried using a liner brush for more precise lines, but I ended up preferring the calligraphy brush, which has a fine tip for delicate strokes and creates an interesting texture. Depending on your paper, you'll get different textures. There's also a small fence that should be indicated, and note the interesting shape of the front windshield of the bus. It's not covering the entire level, so you can see part of the fence behind the bus. At first this was unclear to me in the reference painting, but after researching photos of these buses, I understood what was happening. For the lines, Especially around the windows, I want to highlight that they should be of varying thicknesses. If you're working in this loose style, avoid outlining each window with the same neat line, as that would ruin the overall feel of the piece. Allow some lines to bleed or remain imperfect. If you originally intended for a neater style, then be careful not to make all the outlines overly crisp and uniform. In some areas, the black lines should be thicker, as they represent the depth of the windows or shadows from certain details. Don't overload the drawing with too many black lines. Use them sparingly and only where needed. Finally, erase the masking fluid, add any missing colours, and you're done. The scene turned out bright, with strong light reflections, creating a vivid illumination from the streetlights, even though the sky is quite dark. It's challenging to work from someone else's painting because you don't always grasp the original artist's intent. But I think this interpretation works. When it comes to working with paintings in a different technique, it's especially tricky. If it were a photograph, it might have been easier to determine the right colours for the sky or the road. But overall, I think this piece turned out interesting. If you're really into London scenes, you could give this one a try. Or you might try drawing just the bus without all the extra details around it. I also wanted to show you this loose casual painting style so that you can try incorporating it into your own work. Good luck with your projects. Don't be discouraged if things don't turn out exactly as you planned. Sometimes they turn out even better than expected. Learn from the experience, take note of the techniques and details, and practice. Keep drawing.